City of Stories depends on archival collections that were the gifts of individuals, families, and businesses over time, like this facility. Archives and communities depend on trust to grow their holdings, and the civic collection that this book showcases is a legacy of that community trust over a long period of time. So the book is shaped by two foundational principles: that Surrey is a place to be proud of, a great place to call home. It was as true in the past as it is today, and in historical records and in our community outreach, we heard this sentiment echoed again and again. The second principle is that history is here. It's a long one and it's a rich one. We look to archaeology to help us articulate the depth of history on the landmass that we call Surrey today, and we work to thread the story of Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, and Katzie people through the narrative to the present day. We worked hard to make sure that the Indigenous story wasn't left at the end of chapter 1, which sometimes happens in history books, and to make sure that we wove it through. It isn't perfect, but nothing is, and that's the point. We didn't try to sugarcoat the past, but to highlight diverse stories of resilience, ingenuity, hope, loss, and wonder. So books are a snapshot in time. And archival practices are also a snapshot in time. Collections of non-European material in BC museums has lagged behind a little bit. So part of what our task was to make sure, when we were working on the book, was to make sure that we represented as broad a range of people as possible. So if the archives were a little bit thin in some areas, we had to go out to those communities and make connections and try to draw the material in order to tell the fullest possible picture that we could tell. So what I want to do for a little while now is just to walk you through the book and to talk about my take on history, what we brought to this project, a tour through some of my favorite maps and images. Okay, so foundational principle, simple, right? So history is here. It's made from ordinary things. Old pieces of paper, photographs, the human voice, and memory. It draws from and lives in its context. So as we were working on the book, we were asked to really showcase the collections that were in the city of Surrey. So the archival collection as well as the artifact collection and also the oral history collection. So there is incredibly beautiful photographs in this collection. In the presentation later, there's a larger image of this. This is Loney Farm, Surrey, threshing in 1910. We jam-packed the book with artifacts, put them on the page so that people could see these old things on the page. And here's just a taste of what is in the story. So a few buildings, there's poetry, there's powder, I think that's powder for chickens, and this is like a permed kit. So just a real range of things that were in the archives and in the museum. We tried to make the photographs as big and as lavish as we could in order to really showcase them, because many people didn't really have a sense of the power of that collection, and other books about history in Surrey have tended to be just text and maybe a little bit sepia toned, so we really want to bring that full picture. The color palette of the book was based on this incredible postcard, which didn't actually end up making it into the book, but we chose the colors of the book and the chapters in the book from this postcard of the city of New Westminster burning in 1898. So the designer Bill extracted the colors and made a color palette so that we could get away from, we could have a full color history and kind of get away from that real simple sepia tone that history books often have. So you can see that each chapter, we really wanted a colorful, beautiful history. Each chapter, like I said, is based on this color palette. And each chapter opening features a map that's based on that decade. We had to organize the book into decades because even though we were trying to go for not just a chronological history, but kind of a fat, broad history, we needed to organize it into decades just because of the sheer weight of material we were trying to jam pack in a short time. We needed to have an organizing principle for it to work. So each chapter opens with a map appropriate to that decade. This one is, that's Mud Bay there, and these are the oyster farms in Mud Bay that were there in the 30s. And also, somebody speaks from the archives to open each chapter as well. So we featured the human voice and laid it just right out onto the page. Times were difficult, you know, people just didn't have any money, was from the 1930s. Sookie Inouye, who was a Japanese Canadian who was interned, said, "My loyalty to Canada has been well tested." And so we tried to make it as lavish and beautiful as we could, and also to find places for the maps and to render them at a scale that you could actually read and that they'd be useful over time. As I said, the photograph collection is really good in Surrey, and so we included these fantastic photos as chapter openers and put them in everywhere else. This is the 1930s. These men are shucking oysters in Crescent Beach area in Surrey. They lived in Crescent Beach and at the oyster farm and worked doing that. This is an interior picture from the 1940s, women working in the telephone office. It's very unusual to find interior pictures of women at work, and so when we found this one, we of course used it. This is a really iconic picture, skating at Fry's Corner. It's one that people really remembered from the 1960s. And this family is a Kwantlen family who is tied to the community at Kakate. So Kakate was an old village site that's on the river opposite New Westminster. It's basically where the Patello Bridge comes to the Surrey side. This family has been tied to that place for many, many years. And we asked them, this little guy here is a little older now, and he's the one, Nick Osterforov, who gave me the photograph to include. We also put population medallions in because we want to show the growth over time in easy ways. Original conceptions for the book had us putting medallions or some kind of a connection between the Heritage Register and the books, the photographs in the books, but the Heritage Register seemed to be changing so fast that it was decided that that wasn't going to be a good idea. So history is here, it's made of the things we value. It comes to life through connection, and it's carried in stories. So what do we value and what do we want to share were some of the questions that we asked and tried to answer. So history here had to show thousands of years of Indigenous life that unrolled to the present. It's hard to render thousands of years of Indigenous life unrolling to the present. Phyllis Atkins is a Kwantlen artist, and she gave us this beautiful drawing, which is also on the walls of the City Hall, called Paddling Through the Waves of Change. And what we did was we used it on the end sheets in the book to just sort of symbolically wrap the book in an Indigenous narrative and kind of an Indigenous blessing of some kind. And it is appropriate to the subject of the book as well. So in terms of the Indigenous narrative and unrolling to the present, this is a map from the 1870s. This is, as you can see, the curve of the Fraser River. The Patello Bridge kind of comes in right here. New Westminster is over here. You can see the shape of Old Yale Road coming in and Semiahmoo Trail coming up from the south. And then there's another reserve right in the middle that is called Royal Kwantlen Park. It was a cemetery, and it's now, there's a high school called Royal Kwantlen Park. The cemetery is actually underneath the parking lot of the school. In terms of Indigenous life unrolling to the present, This is another example. This is Thomas Shannon and his wife, Mary Robertson. Thomas Shannon was the first reeve or mayor of Surrey. He was an Irishman. He came to Chilliwack in the 1860s, I believe. He married Mary in 1874, and they came to Cloverdale in 1875. She was a woman who was, her mother was a Stalo woman, and her father was a Hudson Bay Company man. So she was a person with her feet in both worlds. She was born before the gold rush. She lived on the Fraser River through that whole period. And they're important in Surrey because their place was like the intellectual and cultural center of Surrey in the 1870s. Their house is basically where KPU Surrey is now, on that land. And her Indigenous heritage is never spoken of. So we felt it important to include it here. And plus, I just love this photograph. It's relaxed and friendly in some way that oftentimes you don't see in these photos from the 1870s. So there's that family again, Ostraforov family. They're on Bridgeview, basically up the hill from the Red Racer Brewery, if that helps. Yeah, and we also want to show Indigenous life is often portrayed in media as abject, and we want to make sure that we show joy and happiness as well. And so we were really careful about what we chose to include in the book. So history here is deeply multicultural, and it's contested. We understand now, or we're starting to talk a little bit more about the fact that history here has been multicultural right from day one, but for a long time we didn't really talk about that enough. And so what we tried to do in the City of Surrey book was really thread that story right through. This has always been a deeply multicultural place. It was never just Scottish and English people. And so this map from the 1870s shows the beginning of that change in culture, that rolling of one geography over the other. This is a survey map from the 1870s. That's Barnston Island there. And this is the Indian Reserve that's at the foot of 208 Street today. But you'll notice that the post-European settlement is always oriented on the north-south line, and that previous geography has been kind of worked around. So these were lands, they were potato fields and kind of contested lands because they were such good growing in the 1860s and 70s. So we included that just because it shows kind of graphically the contestation there. These photographs are interesting because they're from the 1860s. In the 1860s in the Fraser Valley, they show that the historical narrative is really can sometimes be two things at once. These are 1860s. They're gatherings at the governor's house in New Westminster. The governor believed that he was hosting a birthday party for the Queen on May Day. It was sort of a community builder. 3,000 and 4,000 different amounts every year came. They believed that they were coming not to a birthday party, but to a land, to talk about land, and to talk about the problems that they were having with their land, and the fact that their petitions hadn't worked, and that they were terrified about losing their land. So you can see that at the same time, two things are going on in these photographs. So that idea of contestation can sometimes be subtle. The idea of deeply multicultural. This is a beautiful photograph of one of the first ferries across the Fraser River, and you can see it's carefully staged. But there's a Chinese man in the back that is not spoken of, but he's there taking his place. It's hard for us to find information, and so we're still looking. So if we find photographs like this that just open up a space, it's important to include them, I think, and acknowledge them. Here's that really, really beautiful photograph threshing in Surrey in 1910. And you can see in the back, there's a Sikh man as part of the threshing crew. Same thing. We need to kind of treasure these moments, these photographic moments that show that space where different cultures come together. This is in terms of history being contested, this is a piece from the 1940s. Surrey had a large Japanese community in the 1940s. This map was by a man called Michael Hashiko, who was a prof on the east coast of the US. And he diagrammed the area around Surrey's Berry Hall, and Strawberry Hill, which was a really important Japanese community in Surrey. The Japanese community in Surrey was very connected to each other. They were very much a part of the Surrey community, but they also very much valued their own heritage. And so they worked hard to make sure that language was an important thing. This Berry Hall in the back was a place where these kids were taking Japanese language school. The Japanese community in Surrey also was really involved in the co-op movement. So the berry co-ops, co-ops began kind of in the 1920s, and the Japanese community very quickly grew these berry co-ops in order to sell their berries. This is the Japanese New Year's Day, I think 1940, Japanese growers getting together outside the Berry Hall in Surrey. So in 1942, they lost everything, and that world changed radically. The one piece of an interesting story is the story of this man on the right-hand side. His name was Sookie Inouye. He was born in Japan in 1910. He came to Canada as a young man, he came to Canada in 1910. He signed up for the Princess Pats. He fought at Vimy Ridge. He was wounded at Vimy Ridge. He came back to Surrey, and he got land under the Soldiers Settlement Act. He and his wife operated a very good and prosperous berry farm, which they lost in 1942 when they were sent to Kaslo. So he spent the war years in Kaslo. He was relentless in the letters that he wrote, and the Nikkei National Museum has a whole collection of his letters. He wrote letters, and he was one of the only people, I don't know if he was the only person or one of the only person to actually get his land back. So he got his land back in Surrey, but his home was wrecked, and he had some greenhouses which were wrecked as well. So in terms of the contested nature of history, we wanted to just lay it out on the page to show that it was here and that the history was difficult. On the other side of the page, this is a Dr. Sinclair, who's like a iconic figure in Surrey, and he used to have this car, and if you could hang on to the side of the car, he would give you a ride to school. So I guess every morning he had just like as many kids as could hang on. So history, it's contested, but we also want to show that it's tied into worldwide maritime and land-based exploration. Some of the things that people in Surrey said when we were doing the consultation were, you know, we feel kind of isolated and we feel like people don't know our true story. So we want to make sure that we got this kind of longer, broader picture of when did Surrey start appearing on maps of the world. And there's such beautiful maps that we tried to include some of them. So this is one of the spreads that we created. Semiahmoo, basically White Rock, was the site of the meeting in 1858-59 as they started marking the border across Canada across the province after the Oregon Treaty of 1846 determined where the border was going to be, pretty much. The two boundary commissions, the British and the American Boundary Commission, met at Semiahmoo, basically where the Peace Arch is today, and began cutting a trail through the bush across Surrey. And so we want to just show this moment in history. These colored colored photograph or colored oil paintings are from the University of California at Berkeley. So the two sailing ships, it has always puzzled me how, this is a picture of the British soldiers on the USS Satellite, 1860-61 in Samiamu Harbor. They're so well groomed, and yet they're living on this ship. So one of the things that we did was to put in just some of the pieces of that, what might have been possible. So a straight razor. For some reason, in the depths of the museum, Surrey has, I don't know, 30 or 40 straight razors. So I said, let's put these in. Let's put one of these in. Because they always look so tidy. I don't know how it's possible. So in terms of the land-based maritime exploration, we put in a few other things. So this is a map of the area. This is the Fraser River coming in. Two parts of the Fraser River, the north and south arm. This is Samiamu Bay, so Crescent Beach, Mud Bay is in there. Drayton Harbor down below the border is there. This is a Colonel Moody map of 1860s. He thought it would be a good idea if they just dug a canal that went right from basically Richmond right across the foreshore of the down to Mud Bay. That was the area of a proposed canal. The Macmillan expedition came in 1824 and kind of did a reconnaissance of the area, and then came back 3 years later to set up Fort Langley. And so this document has been around for a long time. I've never really been able to work out exactly where everything was on the land. So we paddled down the Nickel to the ocean from the back of basically the back of Langley to sort of figure out where some of the places were. So this is Blackie Spit, where you can, this is Crescent Beach here in Blackie Spit. And then the points on the Hudson Bay Journal, the Macmillan Expedition Journal, are marked here. So we wanted to show for people how old things can be present on the land. This was basically the portage area here that goes across the Milner Flats in Langley. And this was the place where the Macmillan expedition met the Kwantlen people. So history here contains stories of infrastructure and institutions as well. This is putting the White Rock, putting the railway along the foreshore of White Rock. And this picture here is basically really gives you the same picture as you see today. So we want to show that the crews were really very multicultural. They weren't, they were some First Nations labor. There was Eastern European labor as well. So there was a real range of people. I really like this one. This is a little dump truck. You can see there's a possibility to dump to the side that way. And these tracks could just be lifted up and moved by one person. So as you were moving along, you just moved your track as well, or one or two people. So as they were cutting through the White Rock, they just were able to do it that way. Infrastructure and institutions. You can't be in Surrey without talking about the railway. And if you haven't been on this Fraser Valley Historic Rail, you better get out there and have a look. But in 1910, 1911, the BC Electric Railway was put in, and it went out to Chilliwack. It was possible to get from New Westminster to Chilliwack in about an hour and a half. So it made a really big difference to people and farmers out in the Fraser Valley. Infrastructure and institutions. Here's the Peace Arch, 1921-22. Apparently inside, it straddles the border. So 1 foot is supposed to be on the US, 1 foot is supposed to be on Canada. Somewhere inside, and somebody here might know more than I do about this, there's a relic from the SS Beaver as well as a relic from the Mayflower. And there's supposed to be a time capsule that's supposed to be opened in 2021, so we need to remember that that's there. So infrastructure and institutions are very important, the border. And this one we put in because this is the logging of green timbers. Green timbers was the last old growth logs in the city of Surrey. This is 1923. The New Westminster Board of Trade thought it was such a great undertaking that they chartered a special train to come out to see the trees fall. So these people are there to watch on the special train. You can see they're all hanging off the train as well and excited. We want to put in some artifacts just to give a flavor of the time as well. This is just a close-up of the Peace Arch. One of my favorite, I always say this is my favorite photo, but I say that about a lot of photos, but this is. I love the fact that this is when the speeches were going on. But they never had time to like clean up all the lumber from when they were building the Peace Arch. So people are standing on the pile of lumber. This lady's sitting there with her baby with her back to what's going on, and then there's her stroller right there. So I love the fact that this is just a sort of a slice of life that you don't always see. And there's people up in this window hanging out as well. The Fraser Valley Regional Infrastructure and Institutions, Surrey is very proud of the fact that the Fraser Valley Regional Library system began in Surrey, and that this is one of the book buses that was from the 1930s. It's interesting to note that in the depths of the Depression, 20 out of 24 municipalities in the Fraser Valley, I don't know if they'd even be called municipalities, municipal cities or, I don't know, villages, 20 out of 24 put a levy for the library on. That's how important it was deemed. This book bus went around, and there was 50 stops. I think there was 3 or 4 book buses and 50 stops in the 30s. History here also contains stories of big business and agriculture. So this is just kind of a glimpse that we gave through time of business and agriculture. This is a shot of New Westminster in the 1880s, and there's a First Nations woman walking down the street, very unusual to see in a photograph. This woman came out and homesteaded. She was in her 50s when she started, and she did fine. And then this is the contract from the person for the ferry service across the Fraser River. The connections between Surrey and New Westminster were always really strong right up until the 70s. People really like the fact that the artifacts can be almost touched on the page, and so this spread about Cloverdale businesses, this is the blacksmith store and the mill, can almost be touched and sort of sampled. I'm not sure how well these would work. Gin pills, they're supposed to cure problems with your kidneys. I'm not sure about that. The H.V. Parr store, there's a lot of photographs of stores, sort of successful stores. This is one of the really beautiful ones, and people are all ranged outside. Sort of a snapshot of Cloverdale at the time. This is Mr. Parr here. You know, this guy, he's got a fantastic sweater on when you see this. It's a beautiful sweater. He's got his 2 horses to show the prosperity of it, but we also wanted to show the kind of streets that there were as well. There's a Chinese man in the background, and this is the butcher shop, and he hasn't changed his apron. So just a real sampling of a moment in time. There's straw hats in the window, which you probably can't see on this one, and those are Washington raspberries that they're selling. So they're not Cloverdale raspberries. So infrastructure and institutions, the Surrey port is important part, Fraser Surrey docks, and also agriculture. The Singh farm began in 1940s. The Moriokas had berries in, that's a photo from the 1960s. Infrastructure and institutions, this is Surrey Place Mall. I think it's Surrey Place Mall in the 1970s. So you can see that change to the car culture is just dramatic, especially from, you know, a few years earlier. Just changing geographies. So what we want you to do is to see familiar places with new eyes. This is 152nd Street on the right-hand side. It's changed a little bit. And you know, just the fantastic infrastructure that was created to get the shingle bolts out, right? So the incredible work and ingenuity that was possible, or that was required. And then these are 3 logging camps that were in North Surrey. So North Surrey was a very, Tynehead area was very densely forested, and into the 20s and 30s was logged. There's all kinds of things when you look at this in the book. There's an ox in here. There's even a baby right around here someplace. There's a whole mix of things. It's like trying to find Waldo. In terms of thinking about place over time and the way that we represent place over time, this is a really beautiful photograph of the Mackenzie home in Cloverdale, and it's really carefully staged. It was a post office, but you can see that everything is shown to denote kind of prosperity. So there's a horse in the background, there's a horse and buggy back here, a very nice stroller with a baby in it. There's a couple here with a dog that can't keep still. This guy has a wagon beside him. She's working on a plant, like a rose bush on a stool, and he has a bike. The house is not log, it's partly lumber as well, and also squared off. So there's all ways that this photograph shows kind of a little bit of extra money as well. So here we're coming to some of my favorite photos. We wanted in the book to show that history is often considered, you know, we think, oh, agriculture came and people worked hard and they cleared land for farms. But what we don't very often see is that really tough middle ground, right? So they've got their house built and there is logs and lumber going every which way here. And it looks like it's also been burnt as well. So that really mixed time. This is a man called Pete Lovelady, but the reason I like this photo and I really wanted this one put in is because it shows not only that kind of moment in time where things aren't quite settled. He's got his road here, but you can see that he's got kind of a shack, but he's got some shingle bolts here. Lots of stuff going on, lots of work. There's a kid behind him, but he's dressed up for the photograph, and also his horses are dressed up as well. So that real importance of photographs. In terms of thinking about things that we might not have noticed before, this map shows, it came out of the planning office in Surrey, and it's, to me, a really interesting piece of work. It shows somebody created it on a typewriter, but also each dot equals 50 people. It's 1960s, so really this municipal slogan, "There's room to grow in Surrey," was actually, you know, true based on this. A lot of population, not even a lot of population in the north, but also very, very sparsely populated by those just dots in the south. And then these are just kind of spreads to show the diversity of stories that we tried to tell. The recreation story, which is Crescent Beach and, you know, soapbox derbies. This is a piece of the transportation stories. Those great big wide expanses of the Highway 99 going south that opened up sort of South Surrey, White Rock area in the 1960s. And then people in connection to more central Surrey. This is Tara Singh Hare. He's the only journalist to be assassinated on Canadian soil. He was injured once and put in a wheelchair, and then he was at home about 10 years later, and he was killed in his driveway. And this is more about recreation and place and institutions, so that's Kwantlen Polytechnic University at its beginnings. This photograph, my peer Ryan, I worked with on the book, he was quite a bit younger than I am, and I said, "Oh, we're not going to put that photo of Newton wave pool in the book, are we?" And he said, look, I spent my whole youth in that place. He said, that is important to me. So it's an important lesson in what matters to people. So that's in. And then in terms of change and making sure that we see what's visible, or noticing what's visible, the Fusion Fest is a real coming together of cultures. This was ex-servicemen marching in Newton because they weren't allowed in the Canadian Legion with their turbans on. And this is a giant end of Ramadan in Newton Park. So we tried to capture a real range of stories. The book is shaped by the idea that history is here. It's in our neighborhood, it's in our families, in our communities, and it's a rich history. It isn't a linear chronology. It's robust and growing, and it's an interconnected fabric of connections. A testament, and sometimes it's a testament to the courage to face change. So this is a book about courage. It takes courage to leave home in search of something better, as many of Surrey's earliest newcomers did. It takes courage to forge an honorable life and to be generous with the children of your employer when your own family and children must live far across the sea, as Chinese sojourners of the 19th century have shown, as Filipina, Fijian and Indonesian caregivers continue to show today. It takes courage to return to your old neighborhood and rebuild a life amid those who turned away when you were interned, as Surrey residents of Japanese descent did. It takes courage to stand firm on the land of your ancestors, as Kwantlen, Samiamu, and Katsi people have done and continue to do. It takes courage to work on a green chain in a lumber mill in a language that is not your own when your hands and your back have been trained not for piling lumber but for scholarship, as many Surrey citizens of South Asian descent have proven. It takes courage to build the first Gurdwara and to lobby for rights and fair treatment, decent pay, a chance to rest for your community's grandmothers, or mothers and grandfathers who work hard in berry and vegetable fields. It takes courage to foster a collective spiritual life in a new church or a new mosque with diverse members from across the globe. It takes courage to begin again with nothing, to arrive bereft and to step into the future as newcomers from many lands continue to show. We know that stories can disenfranchise by creating actions that are material. And we know that in the provincial context, stories have exacted social costs. But we also know that the obverse is true. Stories cement community, create space for dialogue and new understandings. Our ambitions were high. We were working to create a book that was not only beautiful, but also trustworthy. We wanted newcomers, general readers, as well as subject experts and academics to find a comfortable place in it. We wanted it to be of such quality it would reset the bar for local histories in Canada. And we wanted it to touch people's hearts, to invite them to see familiar places in new ways. So thank you very much.